Imagine building a life, raising your children with love and trust, only to find your own daughter sold your penthouse to pay her husband's debts and called you homeless. Every hug, every visit, every word now feels like a lie. But this betrayal is just the tip of the iceberg. Hidden motives, family secrets, and shocking twists lurk beneath the surface. And nothing is what it seems. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll discover the truth about love, trust, and the strength you didn't know you had.
I always believed the worst kinds of betrayals come softly, quiet as dust settling on furniture you forgot to wipe, unnoticed until one day you look closely and realize how thick it's become. That's how it began with my daughter, Elena. There was no explosion, no dramatic scene, no slammed doors, just a slow shift in her tone, a strange flicker in her eyes every time I mentioned my penthouse. For years, that place had been my sanctuary, a home I built after losing my husband, a place filled with sunlight, jazz records, and the scent of coffee drifting from my balcony. But lately, Elena hovered around it like someone circling a treasure they weren't supposed to touch. It started with small things, late-night phone calls she'd rush to answer outside my door, conversations she claimed were work-related, even though she hadn't worked in months. Then came the whispers, those muffled, urgent whispers that would halt the moment I stepped into the room. I asked her once if everything was okay, and she smiled too quickly. The kind of smile people use when they're trying to hide the sound of a cracking floorboard beneath their feet. And then, within a week, odd little changes began appearing around my home. Important documents I kept in my drawer, bank statements, property files, insurance papers started shifting places. Some went missing entirely. I first blamed myself, thinking old age was nudging me toward forgetfulness. But I've lived long enough to know the difference between forgetfulness and interference, and this felt like interference. One evening, a stranger arrived at my door claiming he was from building management, wanting to confirm some ownership details. A strange man in cheap shoes, carrying a clipboard, sweating nervously as he asked questions no building manager has ever needed. When I pushed back, he stammered something about updated regulations and practically bolted down the hallway. I remember standing in my doorway afterward, my hand still clutching the knob, feeling the first chill of something dark creeping into my life. I tried calling Elena to ask if she knew anything about it, but her phone went straight to voicemail, twice. And when she finally called back hours later, her explanation was flimsy, rehearsed, as if she'd been waiting for this exact question. "Mom, you're overthinking," she said, laughing too lightly, too hollow. These buildings always change staff. But that night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her pacing the living room, speaking in sharp whispers on the phone. I only caught fragments, words like deadline, buyer, deal, and something that made my blood freeze. She won't know until it's done. I kept still in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt in years. Something was happening, something wrong, something hidden, something meant to be kept from me. And every instinct inside me, every bone softened by age but still anchored in wisdom, screamed that I had barely scratched the surface of it. And the worst part? This wasn't the look of someone who needed help. This was the look of someone planning something, something big, something dangerous, something involving me. I didn't know yet what she was doing or why she was doing it, but I had a sinking feeling that what I discovered next would unravel everything I thought I knew about my own daughter. And that's when I realized the real betrayal hadn't even begun yet. The next morning, I woke with that uneasy heaviness you get when your instincts know something before your mind is ready to accept it. And the moment I stepped into the kitchen, I could feel it. The air had changed. Elena was already there, standing by the counter, pretending to scroll through her phone, but her shoulders stiffened the second she heard me. Normally, she'd greet me with a warm, "Morning, Mom." But that day, her voice stayed trapped somewhere in her throat, and instead she gave me a smile so thin it could have been sliced with a knife. I watched her carefully as I brewed my coffee, noticing the little things I had overlooked before. The way she jumped at every notification on her phone, how she kept the screen tilted away from me as if she were hiding state secrets, and how her eyes darted toward the living room drawer, the one where I kept my documents, more times than anyone glancing naturally ever would. I tried to ask casually about her late-night pacing, but she brushed it off, saying she was just stressed and handling things I wouldn't understand. That line, "things I wouldn't understand," echoed inside my chest like a slap. I'm old, yes, but I'm not blind, and I'm not naive. Age doesn't erase your intelligence. It sharpens your ability to sense lies. She knew that, and yet she underestimated me. Maybe she thought time had made me soft. Maybe she thought grief had dulled me. Or maybe she thought I had no fight left in me. That afternoon, I noticed something even stranger. A neatly folded stack of papers sitting halfway under the couch cushion, as if someone had shoved them there in a hurry. When I pulled them out, my hands trembled, not from fear, but from the shock of seeing my own signature sloppily traced beneath a contract I'd never signed. A contract transferring partial rights of my penthouse. My penthouse. The place I paid for, lived in, cried in, built my life in after losing everything else. My chest tightened, and before I could even breathe, Elena snatched the papers from my hands, her voice sharp and defensive. "Mom, you weren't supposed to see that." She said it as if I was the one invading her privacy, as if I had no right to question what was happening inside my own home. Her explanation was rushed, panicked, full of holes. Something about paperwork for tax benefits, helping us both, not a big deal. But the way she said it felt rehearsed. She wouldn't look me directly, and her hands were shaking. I didn't argue, not then. If she was hiding something this big, this dangerous, confronting her without knowing the full truth would be like walking into a storm blindfolded. So I stayed quiet. Too quiet, maybe. Because later that night, I overheard her again, this time speaking more urgently, her voice cracking with frustration as she said, "No, she didn't sign it yet. I told you she's stubborn. I'm trying, okay? Just give me a little more time. The buyer wants confirmation by Friday." Friday. That was only 3 days away. 3 days before someone expected her to hand over something that didn't belong to her. 3 days before a deal I knew nothing about would be sealed behind my back. The betrayal I feared in Module 1, this was the first undeniable proof of it. And yet I could feel, deep in my bones, that this was still just the surface of something far uglier, something twisted, something with more hands in it than just hers. My heart ached with a pain only a mother can know, but mixed within it was a spark of something else, resolve. Because if Elena thought she could pull this off quietly, she was gravely mistaken. And that was the moment I realized someone else was pulling the strings, and I was about to find out who. For the next 2 days, I moved around my own penthouse like a ghost, silent, watchful, pretending not to notice the hushed conversations, the sudden phone calls Elena would take in the hallway, or the way she kept locking doors she never used to lock. She thought she was being subtle, but guilt has a smell, and deceit has a rhythm, and once you raise the child from diapers to adulthood, you know exactly when they're dancing to someone else's tune. I started digging quietly, not because I wanted to catch my own daughter red-handed, but because the truth had started to taste rotten, and I needed to know what or who was poisoning it. The first clue came when I checked my security system, something I rarely touched because I trusted my home more than anything. But that morning, I felt compelled. And sure enough, the log showed that the system had been accessed remotely multiple times over the last month. Not by me, not by Elena, by someone using an unknown login. Someone who had full access to my cameras, doors, and even the digital files stored on my home network. I felt a coldness crawl up my spine as I realized this wasn't just about Elena being careless. This was coordinated. Someone had prepared for this long before I ever heard a suspicious whisper. Later that afternoon, as Elena left for an appointment, my gut told me to follow the trail she thought she had covered. I checked her room, something I never would have done in the past, but trust had already been burned to ash. Inside her nightstand, tucked under a stack of receipts, I found a business card with a name that hit me like a punch to the chest. Evan R. Malone, Real Estate Solutions. The same man who had tried to convince me months ago that older residents should consider downsizing before they become a burden to their families. His smile had been too polished, too rehearsed, like he had practiced selling bad dreams to vulnerable people. I had turned him away without hesitation. Apparently, he found another route into my home through my own daughter. Suddenly, everything clicked with frightening clarity. Elena wasn't acting alone. She was acting under pressure, maybe manipulation, maybe promises, maybe threats. I didn't know which yet. But the real vulture wasn't inside my family. It was perched right outside, waiting for the perfect moment to swoop in and snatch the only thing I had left that truly belonged to me. My heart cracked all over again, not just because my daughter was involved, but because she had chosen to trust a stranger over her own mother. Still, something didn't add up. Elena was many things, but she wasn't cruel. She wasn't greedy. She wasn't the kind of person who'd sell her own parents' home for convenience or cash. There was a desperation in her eyes lately, a tremble in her hands when she thought no one was watching. This wasn't just betrayal. It was fear. And fear always comes from somewhere. That night, I decided to confront the shadow directly. I dialed Evan's number. He answered on the first ring as if he had been waiting. His voice was too smooth, dripping with charm, but underneath it was something darker. impatience, greed. And when I told my name, there was a pause, a long one, like he hadn't expected me to be the one holding the phone. He said, "Mrs. Hartman, I thought we already had an agreement." Agreement. That single word shattered whatever hope remained in me that this was all a misunderstanding. Someone had forged more than documents. Someone had forged entire conversations. Before he could say another word, I hung up, but the damage was done. I now knew exactly what I was dealing with. A predator, a manipulator, someone who had latched on to my daughter like a leech, sucking her into something she couldn't get herself out of. And the worst part? Elena had willingly stepped onto the battlefield without realizing she was being used as ammunition. I felt my age in my bones, but my resolve grew sharper than it had been in years. This wasn't just about saving my home anymore. This was about saving my daughter from herself, from him, from whatever trap they had pulled her into. And just when I thought I had uncovered the full truth, I stumbled upon a secret so devastating, so deeply hidden, it made everything I thought I knew crumble in an instant, because the real reason for Elena's betrayal was something I never saw coming.
I don't know what hit me first, the silence or the smell. My penthouse always had this warm, lived-in scent. Fresh linen mixed with the faint sweetness of my lavender diffuser. But the moment I opened the door that afternoon, the air felt different, stiff, cold, like someone had been inside who didn't belong there. I stepped in slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight up, and closed the door behind me with a soft click. The echo of that tiny sound reverberated through the whole place like it was hollow. And that's when my stomach dropped. My home, my pride, my sanctuary, the one thing I built after a lifetime of elbows-deep sacrifices, felt like it had been violated. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter, and the metal of my keys clattered a little too loudly, making me flinch. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was just being dramatic, just overthinking. "Get a grip," I muttered. But then I walked into the living room, and everything inside me froze solid. There it was, sitting dead center on my coffee table, perfectly aligned like someone wanted to make damn sure I saw it. A thick, beige folder. Not mine. Not something I ever kept out in the open. My heart gave one hard thud, like someone punched me from the inside. I felt heat crawl up my neck, and suddenly the quiet wasn't quiet anymore. It was loud. It was screaming at me. I knew instantly that the folder wasn't placed there by accident. Someone had been inside my penthouse, and only 3 people alive had keys: me, Lauren, and Ethan. That realization hit me like a truck. My hand shook as I reached for the folder, and before I even opened it, I had a sinking feeling. No, a knowing that whatever was inside was about to turn my world upside down. The moment I flipped back the cover, my vision tunneled. I blinked hard, once, twice, but the words didn't change. Property evaluations, transfer of ownership, sales contracts, page after page of legal jargon, numbers, appraisals, signatures.
My breathing went ragged, like I'd run a marathon while standing still. I flipped deeper into the stack and felt my heart cave in on itself like a paper cup, because there it was, in black ink, in her handwriting, Lauren's signature, again and again and again. I felt the room tilt. I had worked 3 jobs in my 30s so I could afford this home. I skipped vacations, went without luxuries, pinched every penny. And when I finally bought this penthouse, I promised myself I'd never let anything touch it. Nothing would threaten the one piece of life I built with my bare damn hands. And yet right in front of me, my daughter, my only child, had signed paperwork that would rip the floor right out from under me. My throat tightened so painfully I could barely swallow. I tried to rationalize. Maybe she made a mistake. Maybe this was some draft. Maybe she wasn't thinking straight. But with every page I turned, it became clearer this was intentional, not a slip-up, not a misunderstanding. Someone had planned this. Someone had walked into my home, into my life, and started dismantling it piece by piece. My hand landed on something tucked at the bottom, a loose note, folded in half. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Mom, don't panic. This is temporary. Please trust me. That was it? No explanation, no apology, no warning. Just the cold line telling me not to panic, as if a note could fix the fact that my daughter had basically put a knife through the only roof over my head. But even through the shock, a deeper instinct kicked in, a mother's instinct. Lauren may have signed those papers, but something told me she didn't come up with this on her own. No, someone whispered this into her ear. Someone desperate enough, reckless enough, selfish enough to use her love against her. And the second his name crawled through my mind, everything clicked into place with a sickening thud. Ethan. I never trusted that man. There was this slick charm about him, like he was always selling something, even when he wasn't talking. A snake in clean shoes. I knew he carried financial trouble like a shadow, but I didn't know it had grown big enough to swallow my home whole. My jaw clenched so tight I heard something crack. Did he guilt trip her? Did he manipulate her? Or, God help me, did he threaten her? I stood there in the middle of my living room, paper scattered across the table, the city skyline glowing through the windows behind me, but all I could feel was betrayal. Heavy, suffocating, like someone had pulled the rug from under me and laughed while I fell. My legs turned weak, and I had to grip the back of the sofa just to stay upright. I tried to picture Lauren's face, my sweet girl, the one I raised alone with love and grit, and for the first time, I could barely recognize her. What had Ethan done to her? What had she gotten herself into? And worst of all, what the hell was coming next? I gathered the papers back into the folder, pressing them down as if I could force the truth back inside. But nothing could shove away the chilling reality settling in around me. They were planning to sell my home out from under me. My penthouse, my life's work, my security, my future. Someone I trusted, someone I loved was pushing me towards homelessness. I took one more shaky breath, and the room felt like it was closing in. Tomorrow, I'd have to confront Lauren, and that confrontation was going to change everything.
I barely slept that night, tossing and turning like someone had strapped 1,000-pound weight across my chest. And by the time the sun came up, I was running on pure nerve and heartbreak. I drove to Lori's place with my jaw clenched so tight I thought a tooth might crack, rehearsing a
dozen versions of what I'd say. But the moment I saw her standing in the doorway, looking small, pale, and almost guilty, every speech evaporated. "Mom, let's talk inside," she whispered, like she was scared the neighbors would hear. And that alone set off alarms in my head. Lauren was never quiet, never timid, never secretive with me. She led me to the dining table, and seeing Ethan sitting there with his arms crossed, acting like he owned the whole damn house, made my blood boil. He didn't even look at me, just kept staring at his phone like I was some Amazon delivery he didn't bother to sign for. I placed the dreaded beige folder on the table, pushed it toward them, and said, "Start talking." Lauren's eyes glossed instantly with tears, and she reached for the papers like they were a confession she didn't want me to read out loud. "Mom, I was going to tell you," she whispered, but Ethan cut in with his slick, smug voice. "We had no choice, really." That sentence, those 4 words, made something inside me snap like a dry twig. He spoke like selling my home was a minor inconvenience, like tossing out my entire life was reasonable and logical because he decided it was. I turned toward Lauren, refusing to give Ethan another second of my energy, and asked her directly, "Did you really sign this? Did you really put my home on the market?" Her lips trembled, her hands shaking as she whispered, "I didn't know what else to do, Mom. We're drowning." And that was when Ethan finally decided to contribute something useful. He leaned back in the chair, arms spread wide like some cheap movie villain, and admitted it. He had racked up debts. Big ones. Dangerous ones. He used words like urgent, pressing, deadline, as if fancy vocabulary could soften the blow. And then he said the sentence that made my stomach flip over. "Your penthouse was the quickest solution." My penthouse. My sanctuary. My blood, sweat, and sleepless nights, treated like a damn pawn in his selfish game. I stared at him, feeling the blood drain from my face, and asked the only question that mattered. "Why didn't you come to me? Why sneak behind my back?" There was a pause. Deep, heavy, telling. And then Ethan shrugged. Shrugged, like this was nothing more than a parking ticket. He said, "We didn't think you'd agree." And right there was the proof. They never asked because they knew the answer was no. They didn't want help. They wanted control. They wanted access. They wanted my property, not my permission. Lauren tried to justify it with tearful apologies that felt too little, too late. Telling me she didn't want to stress me, that she didn't want me dealing with this at your age. My age?
like I was some fragile piece of glass they could shove into a corner while they tore apart everything I built. The more she talked, the more I realized her words weren't hers. They were rehearsed, influenced, shaped by someone else's desperation. And that someone else was sitting 10 feet from me, pretending to be innocent. My hands were shaking with anger, but I kept my voice steady when I asked the question that had been burning in my chest since the moment I opened that folder. Did you plan to tell me at all? Lauren stayed quiet. Ethan didn't. Look, he said, leaning forward like he was about to give me business advice. The sale is already moving. Backing out now would cause more problems. And that's when the truth hit me, right between the ribs. They had gone too far to turn back. They had already taken steps behind my back, signed things, agreed to things, moved money around. They weren't asking me to understand. They were telling me to accept it. I felt the floor tilt underneath me as Lauren whispered, "Mom, please don't make this harder." Harder? Harder! My world was collapsing and she wanted me to be gentle? I stood up slowly, gripping the chair for balance, staring at my daughter, the baby I raised alone, the child I protected with my entire existence. And for the first time in her life, I didn't recognize her at all. And yet, through all the shock, through all the betrayal, something inside me whispered that this wasn't just desperation. This wasn't just bad decisions. This wasn't just panic. Someone else was pulling strings. Someone else was hiding something. Something big. And that thought hit me so suddenly, so sharply, it felt like a cold blade sliding between my ribs. Because there was one thing Lauren and Ethan hadn't explained. One hole in their story that made everything crumble. One secret I was about to uncover. One truth they hoped I would never see.
It had been packed with bricks, each step heavier than the last, each breath sharper than the one before, because I knew I was about to uncover the truth Lauren and Ethan had been hiding from me all along. The secret that made my blood run cold and my heart slam against my ribs as though it wanted out. I sat back down at the kitchen table, the same one where I had celebrated birthdays, wiped away tears, and poured love into my family for decades, now scarred by betrayal. And I demanded they tell me the whole damn story. No filters, no excuses, no hiding behind the convenient lies that had kept me calm, or at least pretending to be calm, while they manipulated everything I had built. Lauren's hands were shaking so violently, I thought she might knock over the coffee mug I hadn't touched. And Ethan's usual smirk had completely vanished,
replaced by a tension that could be sliced with a butter knife. "Mom, you need to know," Lauren said, her voice barely above a whisper. But even that trembling note held a weight I couldn't ignore. And then she dropped it. The confession, the admission, the hammer I wasn't ready for. She had not sold the penthouse for her husband's debts alone. There was a third party, someone connected to Ethan, someone Lauren had never had the courage to confront, someone who had threatened them both if they didn't liquidate my property, someone who had been manipulating their panic, feeding them lies, pushing them to act fast. It wasn't just desperation, it was fear. Fear of real consequences, real danger. And they had decided to protect themselves at my expense. My stomach churned, my throat tight, my hands trembling as I realized this wasn't simply a betrayal of love or trust. It was a betrayal of safety, morality, and everything I had stood for as the matriarch of this family. And yet, while part of me screamed at them, a bigger, quieter part started piecing together the hints I had ignored. Late-night texts, hushed phone calls, excuses for missing visits, subtle avoidance of topics like inheritance or property. They had been living under a cloud of fear and secrecy, and I had been blind, wrapped up in hurt and rage, failing to see the storm brewing behind their eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, voice cracking but steady enough to hold them in place. Lauren's eyes darted down, shame, guilt, and terror all mingling in one flicker of expression, while Ethan just sat there, jaw tight, looking like a man who had been caught but knew there was no escape. "We didn't want to scare you, Mom," she said softly, almost pleading. "We thought we could handle it. We thought we were protecting you." Protecting me? My mind reeled. All those nights spent wondering if they loved me, if they respected me, if my efforts mattered. They hadn't been lies. They'd been clouded by something darker. I could feel my anger morphing into a calculated kind of calm, the kind you only get when shock and betrayal have stripped you down to your bare bones and left you nothing but clarity. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a brief second, letting all the weight of the last week, the last months, the last years settle over me. And then I opened them again with the focus that cut through their excuses like, "I raised you both to be honest, to be brave, to respect people and property. And I've learned something tonight. You failed to protect yourselves. You failed to protect me. And yet, I'm still standing. I always will." Ethan flinched at the firmness in my tone, at the undeniable authority in a voice he thought he had broken with his selfish actions. Lauren's lips trembled and she started crying, not the soft tears of a child seeking comfort, but the raw, burning tears of someone who finally understands the weight of their mistakes. And then in that moment, something shifted. Not a reconciliation, not a total forgiveness, but an understanding that my power didn't come from the house,
the money, or even the years of sacrifice. It came from my heart, my spine, and my refusal to let anyone make me feel small. I looked around that room, the same room where my home had been gutted of memories, and I realized something almost terrifyingly beautiful. My home wasn't the penthouse. It wasn't the furnishings. It wasn't the investments. It was me. I was the foundation, and no one could take that away. I let them speak, let them spill their apologies and explanations, but I didn't interrupt. Not once. Because every word was a confirmation that I had survived their fear, their lies, and their selfishness. And then finally, the conversation ended. Not with laughter, not with hugs, but with something far heavier: truth. The air in that room was thick, almost suffocating, and I realized I didn't need the penthouse to feel like a queen in my own life. I didn't need their approval, their respect, or even their gratitude. What I needed was clarity, and now I had it. I slowly got up from the table, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders, and said, "I hope you learn from this, both of you. I hope fear doesn't push you into making a habit of betrayal again. But from here on out, I live my life on my terms." And as I walked through what used to be my living room, the walls that had once echoed laughter now whispered my triumph, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Freedom from deceit. Freedom from manipulation. From the chains of expectations that had bound me to their selfish whims. I realized then that the real treasure, the one they could never take away, was my dignity, my resilience, and my refusal to let anyone make me feel small. I turned back one last time to Lauren and Ethan, their heads bowed, and whispered almost to myself, "You wanted my penthouse. You forgot I am my own empire."